morning, everybody. Thank you for tuning into Facebook Live to hear my mother, Lala Fishman's story. My name is Abbey Romanek, and I'm the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. My mother's story begins in August 1939, when Lala was sitting with her friends discussing the beginning of the war, and all they could imagine, the worst they could imagine, was that things would be so bad they wouldn't even have salt for their eggs. They had no idea what was to come. On September 1st, 1939, Lala was standing on the balcony of her apartment in Lvov, Poland. She watched the bombers overhead dropping bombs and killing people on the streets. At the time, she was approximately 17 years old. Within 3 to 4 days, there was a run on all of the food stores. On the 5th day, all those stores were closed. On September 13th, within less than 2 weeks, a number of citizens left Lvov to go east. Other refugees from the west started to come through. A week later, the fall of Lvov seemed imminent. However, the Red Army, the Russians, saved Lvov. Lala's family, which consisted of her mother, her father, her brother Fima, who was approximately 18 months older than Lala, and her much younger sister Risha, all lived together in an apartment in Lvov, along with her aunt. They started taking in the refugees coming from the west. Lala, who had planned to go to Paris to study art, ended up going to school and learned to type in Russian and went to work for an architect. Fima, as a result of the Red Army coming in, was required to go to the army. He was required to sign up and go into the Russian army. Fima was kind of a ladies' man and thought it would be really great to become a pilot. When he came home and told his father he was going to be a pilot, his father said, "Forget about it. You're not going to be a pilot. You are going to be safe and go into heavy artillery, where you are behind the lines and behind the heavy artillery, shooting it out into others." It's more than likely that this advice saved Fima's life. On June 22nd, 1940, air raids occurred in Lvov, and that was regarding the Germans versus Russia. On June 29th, 1940, the Germans took over Lvov. All the Jews, including Lala, had to stay home and had to stop working. In mid-July, all the Jews had to start wearing armbands. Now, I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the yellow stars that most Jews had to wear. However, in Lvov, the Jews had to wear white and blue armbands. In August 1st, the Judenrat was started there, and the Jews could no longer shop in regular stores and were only allowed to shop in Jewish stores. Risha, who I mentioned earlier, was the youngest in the family. Risha was blonde and blue-eyed, as was Lala. However, Risha, being much younger and much more typically Polish looking, was able to go to the store, the regular Polish stores, and buy food for the family. In August and September, actions began, where they started to round up the Jews and take them away. However, some Jews, while they couldn't really work, some could get an Arbeitskarte and begin again to work. By the fall of 1940, Lala had learned that if Jews had a work card, they could be reasonably safe from arrest. Of course, that wasn't necessarily true, and Lala did get a job as a seamstress working for the Germans 5 days a week from 8 to 4. In October of 1940, the Jewish ghetto in Lvov was started. Her father, who, by the way, was a musician and ran the basically the all the musicians in Lvov prior to the war. He was the person who set up all the musicians for all of the clubs. If the clubs needed musicians, he was the person, he was like the booking agent who put all the musicians into all the clubs. In any event, her father had rented a room in the ghetto. The family moved a number of items there, but the family did not move into the ghetto right away. Since most of the Jews had moved into the ghetto, the Germans didn't really bother those who didn't move there. However, the janitor in the building knew that Lala's family was Jewish and decided that he was going to take advantage. So his name was Vaclav, and he came to the family shortly after this all occurred, knowing that they were still there, as well as knowing that Fima was gone and was in the Russian army. He came to their home, knocked on the door. He came with another person, and he told them that Fima, the brother, was outside the city and needed clothing and money. So the family sent Lala to the ghetto to fetch some of Fima's clothing. When she went there, she put on her blue and white armband on her way there. When she went into the ghetto, she took it off because she didn't want anybody there to know that she actually was Jewish. But when she went into the apartment, she found that everything in the apartment that they had rented had been stolen. On her way out, she saw 5 men hanging from their necks from a first floor balcony. She was petrified. She'd never seen anything like that in her life. She came back, she ran home, putting the armband back on after she left the ghetto, and told her family what had occurred. When Vaclav came back, they nevertheless gave Vaclav and the man just some money so that they would go away. Shortly thereafter, men from the families and their friends' families began to disappear. Her aunt's husband disappeared. His name was Yossi. Her father suddenly did not come home. Shortly thereafter, they took Lala. The Germans had learned that rich Jews bought work cards for their daughters, so they started to check all the work cards. Lala was taken to the Yanovska work camp just outside of Lvov. Lala, I hadn't mentioned, who was about 17 years old, possibly 16, was also very rebellious at the time and kind of very full of vim and vigor, chutzpah, as we call it, and really wasn't having very much of the Germans. When she arrived at the camp, she saw 3 groups. She got off the truck. She saw 3 groups of people. One group was about to have their cards checked. One group, she noticed, was on their way to go home. And another group was on their way to another camp. Shortly after she arrived, the truck she was in arrived, she saw that a new group had arrived, waiting for their cards to be checked as well. As the Germans turned from her group to the new group, she slowly but surely moved to the group that was on their way to go home. Suddenly, she got into that group and walked onto the truck with that group to be taken back to Lvov. When she got back to Lvov, she was also still, again, very nervous. So she asked one of the Ukrainians at the time who was with the Germans if they would walk her home. He agreed to do so, and he told her to walk in front of her with her arms up, and he had his rifle and bayonet pointed at her while he walked her home. Her family was so happy to see her, they invited the Ukrainian in and fed him. She was then home for a little while, but the Germans came back in and took more of her family members who had been given up by Vakla, the janitor. Shortly after that occurred, Fima's girlfriend, Mila, who was Lala's age, came to their home. All of her family was gone. And Lala had said to her, "Come stay with us. What happens to us will happen to you." And Lala and Mila had determined it was time for them to leave Lvov. Lala and Mila had friends that were Catholic. Their friends taught them how to genuflect, taught them the prayers, Catholic prayers, and gave them crucifixes. And the two of them learned the catechism, they memorized prayers, and went to church with their friends. Their friends got them birth papers from the church in Lvov. Lala's name thereafter became Urzula Krzyzanouska. While Mila and Lala were now Urzula, were preparing to leave Lvov because it was now only Mila, Lala, her mother, Olga, and little Risha. While Mila and Lala were preparing to leave, Olga could not handle any of this. She had lost her husband. She did not know where her son was, and all other family members were gone. Her mother couldn't handle it and was slowly losing her mind. She was counting linens and just not paying attention to the matters at hand. Nevertheless, Lala had received passports and papers for Risha and Olga so that the four of them could leave. On about September 7th or 8th, they left Lvov and went to the train station. Their plan was to leave Lvov and go to a town called Sanok. They heard that there weren't very many Jews in this town and there wasn't much going on there. They sat separately, Mila and Lala sitting together, Risha and her mother Olga sitting together. However, on their way at a town called Sambor, the Germans got on the train and arrested all four of them. They were all taken to a jail and for interrogation. When Lala and Mila were taken out of the jail, they asked them if they were Jews. When they said no, Lala was smacked so hard she fell to her knees and saw stars. Nevertheless, she and Mila were able to gain their composure, and they were commanded to pray. The two of them genuflected and got on their knees and prayed, and as a result, the Germans let them go. They went through the fields, and they just were thrown out into this town and went through the fields. Unfortunately, she never saw her mother and her sister again. Lala went through the fields with Mila and found a farm. They knocked on the door and told the farmers that they were politically sought. Apparently, this was sort of a term of art at the time, which meant that they might be able to get some help. On the next day, apparently some partisans had seen them thrown out of the jail, and the partisans said that they were being followed and they needed to leave town. As a result, they went back to a train station and got on a train to Krakow. While on the train, they met another girl, a Polish girl, who gave them a place to stay. She told them that she would give them a place to stay and told them where they could go to the work office in Krakow. Lala went to Krakow and worked in a store as a bookkeeper. She was able to stay in Krakow for about 2 years. She worked at the store where she lived daily in a room and lived basically on warm beer with an egg in it. That's what was given to her daily to eat. But nevertheless, she felt safe for almost 2 years. While she was there, however, Mila met a Polish gentleman or a Polish soldier, and she decided that she was going to marry him and continue her Polish masquerade and just try to move on with her life. So Lala moved to another room all on her own and continued to work and go to church. In the spring now of approximately 1944, while on her way to work, Lala was again arrested in Krakow and taken to jail. While she was there for a little while. There were a number of other Jews in the jail. The Jews were there. They were singing Hebrew songs, which Lala knew, but she refused to stay near them, sit near them, listen to them, or even talk to them. She was there for 3 or 4 days, and during that time, she saw the other girls be taken away for hearings, and they would return completely beaten and bleeding and bruised. What she had learned from these girls by listening to them is that one of the ways they had been found out by was that they were asked certain words. And in Yiddish versus Polish, there are certain words that are said differently. One of the big ones that Lala had figured out was that the word for eyes in Polish is augen. The word for eyes in Yiddish is Eugen. Very often this word, one word, tripped up these Jewish girls. So Lala was prepared when it was her turn as to what she would do. Nevertheless, as I mentioned to you, she was also extremely full of vim and vigor. And she did stay away from these girls. When it was her turn, 3 or 4 days later, Lala went into her hearing, and she is unsure what got into her. Nevertheless, she walked into that hearing, and somehow, she used to tell me, she saw the faces of the SS looked like wild boars to her. And she started screaming at them. "How dare you keep me here? Who do you think you are? I have a job to do. You have taken me away from it. I am a worker and I'm a Polish girl. You have kept me here for 3 or 4 days and I have things to do. You have to check this and you have to let me go. Apparently, those that she saw as wild boars were so surprised that somebody like her would come in and behave as she did, that they took her card and they called the labor office and found that in fact, she did have a work card, that in fact, she was working as a bookkeeper and she had been there for a few years and they let her go. She, knees shaking, they said to her, raus, which means leave, out. She quickly got up and scrambled out of there as quickly as she could. When she got home, she was living in the home of a landlord with a landlady, and in a room with another, just a landlady. And the landlady happened to have her son there she wanted Lala to meet her son. This wasn't a good time for Lala to meet her son. Nevertheless, she went home, she excused herself from the landlady, cleaned herself up from a number of days within the jail, deloused herself because it was disgusting and horrible in there. She was filthy, and went to work the next day. However, somebody had been watching her again and came to her and said, I know who you are, and if you don't pay me, I am going to let them know that you are in fact a Jew. And so Lala said to him, come back tomorrow and I will have money for you. Lala went right home, packed up all her things, went to the other side of town, got a new room and a new job. 3 days later, a German officer came to her new job with a janitor. The new job, the German officer came to arrest her. This German officer, she loved telling this story. The German officer was a big fat guy. And as he was walking her back to the jail, an ice cream shop was opening. He told her to wait right here because he saw this ice cream shop and had to go get the ice cream. She looked at him and said, all right, she would wait right there. He walked to the ice cream and she took off and ran to the train. The only train there was a train to Warsaw. She got off at another town called Radom, where she went right to the labor office and got a job as a dishwasher. She was told there that this job was a great job because she would have a place to sleep and she would be allowed to eat all the leftovers. So it was a wonderful job. The only problem was when she went there, everybody eating at this restaurant was SS men. So she stayed for one evening and went back to the labor office and got a new job as a bookkeeper for a farm far outside the city. Partisans there came to her again and told her that she had to move back to the city. She left the farm in October and went to Katowice, another city in Poland. She got a clerical job there at a mining company. She got a clerical job there, and then she was told to go someplace else at one point and was told to dig trenches. That wasn't very appealing to her, so she went someplace else for the clerical job and stayed in Katowice for the rest of the war. She made friends there and stayed there and was able to live out the war in Katowice. In January of 1945, the Red Army was advancing, and on January 28th, the Germans withdrew. She found at that time that she had survived the war, but lost everybody. She continued working at the coal company in Katowice and stayed Urzula Krzyzanouska because she didn't know what else to do. She then remembered that she did have an uncle in America who had left before the war. So she decided that since she had nobody else in Poland and her family was gone, that she would go to America. So in early spring, the American Red Cross opened in Katowice. She went there and registered for the first time with her real name, Lala Weintraub. When the war actually ended on May 8th, she still didn't tell anyone her real name except for the Red Cross. After registering, she would go to the Red Cross every so often to check in and find out if anybody else had contacted her or was looking for her. One day she went there and found that she had gotten a letter from an uncle of hers, and from her uncle rather, in America, and learned that her brother Fima was alive. Another day, her uncle Herman, a different uncle, appeared at her office. He told her he was taking her to the American zone of Germany into a camp. She dropped everything, went and packed the few things she had, and got into the truck that he had and went to a camp. All of a sudden, she of course was thrilled to be with family, but then realized she was on her own, of her own volition, going to a camp, something that she had avoided throughout the war. So she wasn't very happy about it, but before entering the camp, she burned all of her Catholic papers. She went to the camp and registered all of her family names. Nevertheless, she had some papers from her uncle and was determined to go right to America. She had heard that there was a joint distribution committee right near this camp and was very determined to go to the Joint Distribution Committee, the American Joint Distribution Committee, show them her papers and get on a plane and go to America. So as soon as she could, she got up and walked across a long way and lots of rubble because of the war to the Joint Distribution Committee office. She had her papers with her, her precious papers with her, and walked from a place called Hasenecke, where the camp was, to the city of Kassel in Germany, all within the American zone of Germany. She spent the entire morning walking there. And when she walked in, she became very downtrodden because the office that she walked into was just packed with people just like her. Suddenly, the colonel, the American colonel, walked out of the office and looked around. He'd been talking to people all morning. He walked out and he looked around and he just seemed to want to stretch. He looked around and he saw Lala and he pointed at her and said that she was next. Everybody else gave her dirty looks because they had been waiting much longer. Nevertheless, Lala got up and walked in, and with a mixture of some German and some Yiddish, Lala told the colonel her story. The colonel, who was an American-born rabbi from Brooklyn, did not have the heart to tell her that she wasn't going to be getting on a plane anytime soon, that there were a lot of quotas, and it would be a while before she could go to America. He told her that the best way for her to go to America, the soonest, was for her to marry an American soldier. She scoffed and left. The part that he didn't tell her was that the American soldier was going to be him. I always do this. So the colonel was my father, Rabbi Morris Fishman. So later that day, when she got back to the camp, a car arrived at the camp, and the driver of the car came out and told Lala that the colonel wanted her to come to the circus with the colonel that evening. And so the rest is history. They were married in the camp a couple years later and emigrated to the States, stopping, by the way, in Israel, where my uncle Fima was fighting for Israeli independence. So I will stop there and take some of your questions.
Thank you so much. We do have a couple. Your mother's story is remarkable. When did you first hear it?
I can't remember, because I don't remember not hearing it. I heard it from a very, very young age. My mother basically remade her entire family almost exactly as hers was. As I mentioned, she had an older brother, Fima. She and Fima were approximately 18 months to 2 years apart. And then she had this much younger sister, Risha. And that's exactly how I am. I'm the much younger daughter, sister. So, you know, I'd been hearing it my whole life.
And so then when did you start sharing it, and what brought you to that?
I started sharing it. I mean, I actually have the date right here on my little folder. In 2014 is when the Speakers Bureau started doing the second generation workshops.
Right. So did your parents ever go back to Europe? Have you been and kind of retraced any of that history yourself?
We did. We went back in 1987 or 88. 1988, we went to Lvov, actually. That was my mother's first time back. And so the three of us went to Lvov and Russia, but mostly Lvov, and to Lvov, and it was amazing. She was very nervous to go back. She was scared and thought it would be very, very difficult, but she loved it. She ended up having wonderful memories of her childhood when we were there. We were actually able to go back and see the actual apartment that she grew up in, the apartment where the balcony where she stood and everything. And a couple of years after that, she went back again with her brother, and they went to the Yanovska camp and saw a monument where her father's name was written.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
What happened to other family members who had survived?
You know, well, her uncle Isidore, who was the one who put them together, lived in Perth Amboy in New Jersey. Fima was in the Israeli army. His story is in the book Lala's story, and is amazing in its own right. It's a whole story. He lived in Israel, emigrated to the United States after his second child was born, and lived in New York and then in California, and did very well. Mila, however, remained in Poland, we learned, and her brother, she had a brother that Fima found years later, living in Canada. Lala's family did not survive. Her parents so her father was killed in Yanovska, and her mother and Risha were killed in one of the concentration camps.
What happened to Mila's friend and the Catholic girls who helped them?
Don't know. No idea.
Can you share a little bit more about how your parents met? And you kind of talked about it, but it was an amazing meeting. So
well, yeah, after it was interesting because my mother really didn't want to go on the date. They went to the circus where she'd never been, and she'd never eaten popcorn before at the circus, which was cute. She really didn't want to go, but her uncle Herman, pushed her to go. But obviously she did go, and they were together it took about 2 years because he was stationed there in the displaced persons camps, helping the displaced persons. And he actually started, people were living there, the Jews were living there, reclaiming their lives in their Judaism for a number of years before they could be placed elsewhere and move on with their lives. So he found her a job within the displaced persons camps. She was a secretary within the camps for a number of years. They had a decent life within the camps. When they did finally get married and it was time for them to come back to the States, they stopped. They went to Paris first. Actually, I don't know if it was first or second, but they went on a honeymoon, basically, partly to Paris and to Israel. They went to Israel just as it was born to see FEMA. So
amazing.
she was able to find her brother.
That's so amazing. What year did they come to Chicago?
They came to Chicago not until 1963. Because they moved back to Brooklyn first. And my father, because my father was still working for the Joint Distribution Committee, and they lived in Brooklyn with my father's parents because he was still traveling around the country raising money for the committee, trying to help all the refugees. So my mother was there trying to learn English and going to school. And then they moved around the country a few times, different places.
You had talked about a janitor. Do you know anything about what happened to them?
Not a clue. No.
And then I think I see one more question. How has your mother's story influenced your life?
Oh, tremendously. Well, obviously, with the work I do with the museum, and the work I do all the time with, I work with the museum on anti-Semitism and bullying and hate. The work I do as an attorney and as a judge to make sure that people, on fairness, equality, and justice.
Thank you so much. We so appreciate the work you're doing in the museum and out, and thank you for sharing. It looks like that's all the questions we have.
Okay, thank you.